We all want to see a full college football season from start to finish in its completion, but I don't know if there's a fan base that's more excited for college football in 2021 than the OU fan base. We got Jason Ray on the line from Last Word on College Football, and this is an Oklahoma segment that we've been producing for a number of weeks now, but we're going to take it to the next level and involve all of you in a live stream that we would like to delivered to you each and every Friday. We don't know. You're going to have to check out the notifications from week to week because schedules change. But our aim is just about every Friday to come to you and talk Oklahoma football. Jason, how you doing today?
Good, Mark.
Absolutely. This is awesome. So, again, going to talk Sooners football for the next hour to 90 minutes here at the Voice of College Football. And if you have yet to subscribe, please lock it right in here. You can see that we produce content all the time on Oklahoma football. Jason loves the Sooners, writes on the Sooners over at Last Word on College Football. So check out his work there. Just last night, to tout Last Word even more, we had Tony Syracuse on the line to discuss the new Pac-12 commissioner. So the college football content on Last Word on College Football is first rate. So check out Jason's work on Oklahoma and the Big 12 in particular. So a little bit later, we're going to run down our top 25, the way too early top 25, look at Jason's, compare it to mine, have that fun discussion. But first, Jason, here in the last week, a couple commits from the 2022 class, and outside linebacker Kip Lewis, and also Jaden Rowe into the fold.
Yeah, it actually got Oklahoma back up into the top 5 overall in the 2020 rankings, according to 247 Composite. Number 1 in the Big 12 at this point. Of course, it's still obviously very, very early. So, you got a 4-star commitment from Carthage, Texas, Kip Lewis, 6'1", 200 linebacker, top 25, 26 overall at the position in the country from a linebacker perspective. And then Jaden Rowe, who is a local product of Tulsa Union here in Oklahoma. He's a 3-star, but the size, again, we've talked a lot about like what Grinch likes specifically from a secondary perspective. 6'3", 210. So he's got that size from a cornerback, safety, athlete position perspective. Right now is where he's ranked, but he'll probably certainly be a cornerback at Oklahoma. He's a little raw. He is a 3-star, so he's not extremely highly rated. But I think more importantly, that inroads within the state of Oklahoma from a recruiting perspective has been good as of late. And Oklahoma wants to tap into that a little bit more. Certainly with Gentry Williams still as an uncommitted prep star here in 2022, who is probably the top ranked, or at least the top couple 2 or 3 kids in the state of Oklahoma. So yeah, getting that up to number 5 is good. Oklahoma's They've got a lot of commitments on the offensive side of the ball. They're focusing a little bit more on the defensive side of the ball here as we get into the summer.
Jason, if you're a California school trying to compete for a Pac-12 championship, Texas school, Florida school trying to compete for a conference championship, you can pretty much stay at home, get the job done. Sure, you're going to go elsewhere to the best players and try to get them as well. I liken Oklahoma situation a bit to Ohio State situation. Ohio high school football has always been extremely strong, but it's not as strong as it was in the 80s and 90s. People are moving south, they're moving west. It's still a top 7 to 8 to 9 state in the country in high school football, but that drop from the top 2 or 3, it's pretty much of a cliff, but it's still strong high school football. But you cannot compete for national championships at Ohio State just staying at home. Similarly, when I look at the 11th rated player in the country at cornerback, the 62nd rated cornerback in the country in Caleb Rowe, according to the 247 Sports, and I see that he's the 11th rated player in the state. Where would you assess Oklahoma high school football? How strong is it? How much does Oklahoma, and again, I go back to some of my conversations with Ohio State, where they have to balance keeping those in-state connections and staying strong in state to show that there's that loyalty and that tie, but at the same time saying we're a national program, we've got to go out there and get the best players.
Yeah, Mark, it's a really interesting conversation. I think over the last few years, specifically since Lincoln Riley has taken over, they've had a little bit of a different approach, really from a national perspective, to they've always recruited Texas very well. They've always recruited, Arkansas, Louisiana, those areas, but they're being a little bit more, I think, choosy in terms of the guys that they're going to get nationally. Really, I mean, you mentioned California and Florida as really, some of the top states in terms of high school talent. But I think Oklahoma is up there. They've been a little bit up and down. They've typically, over the last, 5 or 6 years, they've had 1 to 2 kids that have been really good high FBS Power 5 team talent. This year, the 2022 class is probably the best class in terms of Oklahoma prep athletes that they've had in quite some time. There's probably about 4 or 5 kids that are really good on the national stage. So I think it's very important. I think the typical, I think, local fan likes to see you get a lot of local products in. There's some, there's a lot of debate on, if you're a local Oklahoma product, maybe it means a little bit more to you. I mean, I don't put a lot of stock into that, but I think what Oklahoma really needs to do a little bit better of a job of is really getting those. You can still be choosy and then get those great players within the state. They've not really done a good job of that over the last few years. There's been a lot of good talent that's went outside the state. Ohio State with a Proctor kid a few years ago, and then just a few of those kids that have really kind of slipped through their hands. So I think, to answer your question, Mark, I mean, it's certainly not one of the top 10 states in the country in terms of high school talent, but I think that Oklahoma has to be really good at getting those top kids to stay in state.
And I think you hit on something there, again, focusing on making a correlation between Ohio State's situation and Oklahoma's, where you want to get the best players in the state, because those best players in the state, they are good enough to play for you, whether that's the top 4 or 6 of the top 9, something in that range. 7 of the top 11, that's about where it starts to drop off, it seems, in a state of that caliber. But then again, you've got to fill out 85 scholarships and 105 roster spots, or something in that vicinity. 105 seems to be the number. So then why not stay in state for those guys that are going to be program players? They're going to be 2 to 3 stars that are going to serve on special teams. And why not make that, again, continue that relationship with the high school coaches association and the in-state element to fill out the roster with a lot of in-state guys. I don't know what the population is in Oklahoma. What roughly does Oklahoma stand nationally in terms of population?
Oh gosh, I mean, I know the greater Tulsa area is around, I believe, around 1.5 million, a couple million. So I mean, it's not. I don't know off the top of my head. It's one of the smaller states, I think, in the country, probably, in the 30 to 40th range overall, I would say, from a population perspective. Yeah, and I think it's a good point that you make, specifically around some of the lower tier talent in the state of Oklahoma. The one thing that Oklahoma has done a good job, and they've taken a couple, 2 or 3, 4 kids over the last couple of years, specifically this year, as preferred walk-ons. Really specifically when you're kind of talking about the 105-man roster, the 85 scholarship roster that you're looking at for Oklahoma. So they've got a couple of quarterbacks that they brought on as preferred walk-ons, a couple players on the defensive side of the ball, even one kid as of late on the, I believe, a linebacker to be a preferred walk-on. So yeah, there's been a couple of kids just from a roster supplementation perspective that Oklahoma's been able to do.
Got 20 on the line here live, talking Oklahoma football, and I know that this has been a bit of a late notification, so thank you so much for joining us. So welcome to our Oklahoma station right here at the Voice of College Football, and we've got 22 team channels, and the Sooners are one of them. So if you love Oklahoma football, or if you're just a college football fan, and I run into this all the time, there are a ton of college football fans out there that just want to keep track of all the big programs and all the big brands. And so lock it in right here. Jason has been instrumental in ensuring that we're able to provide a consistent content here. So you've probably checked that out. Now understand that we aim to be here live just about every week. is our goal. We've got vacations and other obligations and responsibilities, but for the most part, we expect to be here every Friday for just about a half hour to an hour. We'll do close to 90 minutes today talking college football in Oklahoma and the Big 12 in particular with Jason. So again, that's the outside linebacker in Kip Lewis. And you also have Jaden Rowe, the cornerback, 62nd rated in the country, number 11 in the state of Oklahoma. And for Kip Lewis, outside linebacker, as Jason mentioned, top 25 at his position. And he comes out of Texas, a top 50 player in the state of Texas. Bob Stoops certainly didn't have issues recruiting, but Lincoln Riley has taken it to another level. Again, number 1 in the Big 12, top 5 in the nation as it stands early on here, according to 247 Sports. All right. Anytime somebody says like 2023 to me, Jason, it seems like that's like 100 years from now in the space age or something, but 2023 is right around the corner. We don't talk a whole lot of recruiting that far out, but this might be a special case with this particular quarterback.
Yeah, I'm with you, Mark. I mean, these kids change their mind 4 or 5 times in a given year. So how often they'll change their mind before that 2023 signing day actually comes? But a kid that's really gotten a lot of talk over the last really couple of weeks, Mark, is a kid named Malachi Nelson. He's also out of California, a quarterback. He's a 5-star quarterback and really one of the best quarterbacks in the modern era. And so when we talk about modern era, really kind of the last 20 years that recruiting rankings have really kind of taken hold. So he is the number 2 overall quarterback in the 2023 class, the number 4 overall player, tied with Arch Manning, which is a name that everyone knows, overall. So he's a kid that's really gotten a lot of crystal ball predictions to Oklahoma over the last couple of weeks. Every single one is headed towards Oklahoma with a really, really high expectancy rate in terms of confidence rate in terms of if he'll come to Oklahoma. So he's scheduled to commit in July, middle of July. So we'll see. He was going to take a visit to Clemson, and then through that visit, he was actually going to go to Alabama as well. It looks like those trips are a little. Right now, they're not completely canceled, but it looks like he's pointing towards not wanting to go to those as of right now. So it looks good for Oklahoma. Again, this is a kid that's top 15 overall, not this year, in the past 20 years in terms of his rating right now. Like I said, tied with Arch Manning. He's a kid that, if you can kind of believe how good Oklahoma has been, specifically Lincoln Riley, recruiting the quarterback position, he's a little bit higher than Spencer Rattler, a little bit higher than Caleb Williams in terms of his recruiting ranking right now. So it would be a good get for Oklahoma, with the caveat that we know it's a lot of time for him to certainly flip or change his mind or anything like that. But a couple of things that really kind of ring true with him is, as he's talked about, his 2023 commitment when he verbally commits to whoever it is. If it's Oklahoma, he's a kid that, number 1, he wants to be the number 1 quarterback and really the only quarterback in that class. I think you can take that a couple of ways. If he's not necessarily scared of competition, but I think he just kind of wants to be the guy. And then I think the second thought is he has said he wants to get familiarized with the scheme, with the coaching staff, with the roster, and then be in a position for him to recruit as well for any of those 2023 kids that may be on the fence or maybe looking at Oklahoma. So it would be something that on the outside of Oklahoma's 2022 barbecue that they're looking at. So this will happen in July as of right now, unless he pushes it back or even pushes it forward. So really a guy that Oklahoma has been in on. I think, like I said, Clemson and Alabama are in the mix. USC is a team that's maybe a little bit in the mix as well, but Alabama and USC both have a couple of guys that they are in on and pretty solid on from a quarterback position perspective. So it really looks to be kind of an Oklahoma-Clemson battle at this time, maybe Alabama from an outside perspective. So it'll be interesting as this goes kind of through the summer and towards the end of the summer, mid-July, where he actually ends up committing to.
26 on the line. Welcome to the voice of college football, Boomer Sooner. We got Jason Ray on the line. Last Word on College Football. Please check out his work. Again, Last Word on College Football. Jason loves the Sooners. He's got great insight, great take on Oklahoma football, specifically a number of videos that we posted here, post-spring game in particular. As we get into the summer, we'll certainly take the deep dive position by position to get you set for August camp. We appreciate everybody being here. We've got, let's see, we've got Brandon on the line. We've got Cuba on the line. Christopher, thank you so much for the comment. Natty or Bust, love the content on this show. Keep up the great work. Brandon, thank you so much for the comments on Malachi. Got GM Slayer. My worry about Arch is that his last name boosts his rating. Well, once they get on the field, you don't worry about the ratings. They got to perform anyway at some point. So want to let all of you know that our aim is to be here just about every Friday outside of any other obligations, but just about every Friday at 1:30 Central, 2:30 Eastern. But again, lock it in with the notifications. That way you get the notifications to know if we need to move that time or that day with our Oklahoma live show. But we're excited about this. This is our first dive into the live stream on the Oklahoma side. So ultimately, you guys produce the show. So understand that Jason and I have no issue sitting here for an hour talking college football. We'll do it. But if you leave your comments and questions, we'll address them. So you ultimately produce the show. All right. Good stuff. All right. People love speculation. People love predictions. I don't think the national championship game gets down to double zeros before people aren't hitting me up with top 25 lists and who's going to win who's going to be in the playoff next year and so forth and so on, which I always say, this is unofficial. I'll give you my thoughts right now, but the official picks will come out in August. But for right now, we're going to run down Jason's way too early top 25. And I posted mine a couple months ago. So if you're not familiar, you Oklahoma fans who are locked in on the Sooners and on this particular channel, I've got a main channel, Voice of College Football. Please look it up, MarkRogersTV, Voice of College Football, and posted a video a couple months ago with my way too early top 25. I just gave it a look, jotted down my 25. So we'll compare it to Jason. So let me, I'll pull this up and we'll get started on Jason's 25. Are we going to take this from 25 and count on up?
Yeah, let's do it that way.
All right. So this again, Jason Ray's way too early top 25 and number 25, Iowa State fans' favorite team right there, Louisiana.
That's right. You know, Louisiana could end up being kind of a thorn in the side of the Big 12. You know, they're a team that, you know, was really obviously, to your point, Mark, started really well with the upset of Iowa State. Went 10-1 last year, I believe. Their only loss was to Coastal Carolina by a field goal late in that game. Returned 20 starters overall from a team that won 10 games. You know, was really good at the quarterback position. Levi Lewis comes back. You know, overall 53 touchdowns, I believe 14 interceptions for his career. So we talked a little bit about the schedule. They open up with Texas in Austin, opening game of the year. Will be obviously a big game for both sides. You know, this team, if Louisiana somehow is able to spring that upset, they could potentially look at going 10-0 until they have a tougher game. I believe it's Appalachian State later in the year. Could be a little bit of a tough game, but you know, this is a team that is very much deserves to be in that top 25 overall, and then starting them at 25.
I was disappointed not to see a Sun Belt championship game last year because Louisiana would have played Coastal Carolina again in a rematch. And of course, Coastal Carolina went through the undefeated regular season, beat BYU, lost a bowl game that was quite exciting. and Louisiana took on Texas San Antonio in its bowl game. Of course, the aforementioned 17-point win in Ames was impressive. Louisiana is a legit team. And to your point, to give a different statistical take on what you outlined, I've seen various measurements of them having the most or nearly the most production in the country coming back for 2021. So Louisiana, certainly Texas didn't know what they were getting when they signed up for that series.
Right. No, absolutely. And I've seen some, kind of looking at some rankings. I've seen Louisiana as high as 15th or 16th overall right now. So to your point, yes, they have, some of the best returning talent in the country coming back next year. So it'll be. I mean, to your talking about Texas, what a way to open up your career as a head coach at Texas if you're playing a team like Louisiana, which you're, I think historically expected to win fairly comfortably. For Texas, for Steve Sarkisian coming in.
Because as you well know, except for your knowledgeable college football fans, if Texas loses that game, or even if they win close, there's going to be 80% of the people out there going to be, what's wrong with Texas? What's going on? This guy's supposed to be good. But then even out of the knowledgeable fans, they're going to say, well, we know that this team's really good, Louisiana, but Texas still should beat them.
Sure.
So it's going to be an expected win. There's a no-win situation there for Texas, but certainly a great measuring stick for both teams early on, and an under-the-radar, really good matchup to start out the season. All right, on to number 24.
Yeah, no. So, Mark, number 24, I have Penn State. 4-5 last year, but they did win 4 in a row to end the season. Really, kind of a nightmarish start for the Nittany Lions. They bring back quarterback Sean Clifford comes back. They don't have a lot of depth behind him, so I think, as far as I've been able to see, I don't know that they've actually brought anyone from a transfer portal perspective, but they don't have anyone currently on the roster that has thrown a pass at the collegiate level. So that's probably a little bit concerning for Nittany Lion fans looking at that. They've brought in about 4 grad transfers to help bolster that talent on the defensive side of the ball. That's always a little bit kind of nerve-wracking for a team when you're banking on, that many grad transfers coming in to kind of help your team. The schedule's tough to begin with. They open the season at Wisconsin, then they face Auburn. So they've got a couple of tough games early on in the season. So if they can happen to get by Wisconsin and Auburn, puts them in position to be a lot go up the rankings a little bit, but yeah, I think I've got Penn State to start the season at number 24.
The deal with Penn State, and once they dove into that 0-5 hole, people were just going crazy about James Franklin needs to go, and I was like, let's put the brakes on this. They finished in the top 15 in the country 4 consecutive years, top 10 3 of those 4 years, won BCS bowl games. New Year's 6, to be more correct now, bowl games. Okay, they lost maybe the best defensive player in the country days before the season started. He opted out. Journey Brown, their number 1 running back, who ran for over 200 yards in the Cotton Bowl the year before, unfortunately came down with a horrendous type illness and will no longer play football. He's gone. They lost their 2nd string running back, who was a top 5 running back in the nation coming out of high school, on the first drive of the season against Indiana. So they were down to their number 3 running back like that. Yeah. You mentioned the quarterback situation. Will Levis was a guy that they would bring in as kind of a change up to Sean Clifford, who was a runner. He transferred out. So you're correct in saying Sean Clifford's got to stay upright this season for Penn State to have a shot. Now, they've recruited top 8 to 15 in the country to build this particular roster. So they're not necessarily on Ohio State's level, but they've got a puncher's chance, and they're probably the one team in the division that does. Right. Not that they're going to get it done, but they got a puncher's chance against the Buckeyes.
Yeah, absolutely. So number 20. So the Pac-12 is really kind of interesting, Mark, just from a conversation. When you look at 2020, most of these teams had 4, maybe 5 games. So it's hard to it's very difficult to judge them based on the performance with such a small sample size. Arizona State can be a team, from my perspective, they could win the Pac-12. I think they're that good. Again, and they're another team here that has a ton of starters back, 20 starters total on offense and defense. Jaden Daniels is one of the better quarterbacks in the country. 3 interceptions in 2 years combined, really takes care of the ball. With their schedule, they have an opportunity to win a few games. Probably should start 4-0. When you look at in conference, they have 3 pretty tough road games. When you look at, they go to UCLA, to Utah, and to Washington. So those 3 games are pretty tough in terms of the Pac-12, but the talent is there. One of the things that I look at personally, Mark, when I'm kind of looking at some of these way too early top 25, I look at the quarterback position and I look at both offense and defensive lines. Are they, if you're solidified on both of those offense and defensive lines, you can help the quarterback out if maybe he's a little, not necessarily in this case, but if you have a guy that's not as seasoned, and then certainly on the defensive side, maybe if your secondary is a little weak, your defensive line can help you in that capacity. So this is a team that's pretty good up front on both sides of the ball. And then mentioned Daniels is really one of the better quarterbacks, not only country, but certainly the Pac-12 as well.
Jason, it's a great point that you make, because I heard a NFL general manager say recently, and I think it applies to the college game, that when he projects toward the next season and who's going to be good and who's not going to be good, in addition to the starting quarterback, he looks at the offensive line. He looks at both lines, starting with the offensive line, because college football nation knows the names, and most of the names are on the outside. They're carrying the football, they're running with the football, and the offensive lines get forgotten, but they're the continuity of the team. And Arizona State's an interesting team. I think it's intriguing. Number one, they got the NFL head coach that many people questioned, and I certainly was in that camp as well. Do they know what they're doing? Do they know what they're getting into? Is he disconnected from the collegiate game? Well, and another intriguing portion of this is that because of his background and his connections, he has basically built an NFL coaching staff. Marvin Lewis is coaching the defense along with Antonio Pierce. Like, they've got NFL coaches on both sides of the ball. And Herm Edwards is doing what he does best. And that's not being a game manager or a clock manager, believe me, from his days with the Jets. That's not his forte. He's a salesman. He knows football. Of course, he played his whole life and coached it his whole life. I'm not discounting his football knowledge, but he's not a grinded down to the nth degree football coach. He's got other guys to do that. It's an intriguing situation there at Arizona State. And you mentioned Jaden Daniels 2 years ago as a true freshman. He led the nation in fourth quarter comeback wins at places like Michigan State and against Oregon. So it's an intriguing team there at Arizona State. And to your point about the entire Pac-12, Jason, I don't know if those teams are going to be rusty or they're going to be fresh, but they barely played any football last year.
You're right. It's very, very interesting to see. With the Pac-12, we really don't know what to expect. I think it's almost like you can take 2020 as a wash, as like almost a no season for a lot of those teams.
Absolutely. All right. Max to the Big 12 here.
Yeah. So at 22, a team that is, from a negative perspective, near and dear to many probably that are watching this. So Oklahoma State at 22 had a really solid year for the most part. Last year, they, obviously Oklahoma was able to beat them in Bedlam 41-13 in that game in Norman, but, much improved on the defensive side of the ball as compared to how they've been in the past. So they've got a couple of key kids that they're going to have to replace on the offensive side, Chuba Hubbard and Tylan Wallace. I think they got a decent amount of talent there, specifically at the running back position. And then at the wide receiver position, they got a local kid, Brendan Presley, who played really well in the can't remember the bowl game against Miami that they played, and was it the
Jesus Bowl?
Jesus Bowl, that's right. So, but he played really well, had over 100 yards receiving and 3 touchdowns in that game. So, Spencer Sanders is a wild card. When you look at him over the last couple of years for Oklahoma State, he's been up and he's been really down. Had problems keeping, turning the ball over the last couple of years. Fumbled, interceptions, whatever it might be. So for him to be a little bit more consistent will be big coming into 2021. I think probably the biggest question mark for Oklahoma State is the offensive line. Offensive line really struggled, gave up, I believe, 27 sacks on the year. Was really kind of a catalyst for Sanders turning the ball over so much. So they lost Tevin Jenkins to the NFL, so he was one of their kind of linchpins on that offensive line. So it'll be interesting to see how they can replace him. They got an interesting matchup early in the non-conference season at Boise. Not sure. Again, the Mountain West, almost the same conversation as the Pac-12 in terms of just kind of a small sample size. So if they can get past that game, certainly they got Oklahoma and Iowa State and Texas to contend with in the Big 12. So, this is probably about where they started last year. And of course, they I think they got all the way up into the top 10 at one point during the season last year. So it'll be interesting to see if, I think really specifically, if Spencer Sanders can take that next step and then the improvement on the offensive line.
Yeah, I don't necessarily know what to think of Spencer Sanders, because at times I think that he has the potential to be one of the top quarterbacks in the nation. Then he goes through stretches at times where it's like, okay, what is he doing out there? He's
Right.
like careless with the football, throwing it around all over the place. I did not necessarily think that Oklahoma State was the best team in the Big 12 last year, but I thought that they were playing the best until they hit Norman. I think that's where the game was. I think it was at OU, and then just got shellacked. And of course, Oklahoma was on a roll and then really showed that, okay, yeah, we've been beating up marginal teams, but yeah, we are the best team in the conference. Chuba Hubbard's gone. Yeah, Spencer Sanders, a bit of a wild card, but still a tremendous athlete. And they took on Boise State. Now, Boise State's not necessarily the program that they've been over the last 15 to 20 years, but still a very capable program that had a really good season a couple of years ago, came to Stillwater and got handed a pretty stern loss against Oklahoma State. So now the Cowboys have to go to the blue turf. We'll see how that, but again, I'm going to be fascinated by that game to see how the Broncos and the Cowboys match up as we make our way through the top 25. Again, this is Jason Ray, last word on college football, and his way too early top 25. And I'll let you know as we go. I've kind of forgotten to do this. Let's see. So far, so you got Washington at 21. I don't have Washington in my top 25 at this point. You had Oklahoma State at 22. No Oklahoma State in my top 25. You had, who'd you have at 23?
Let me see. Let me go back here and look.
I'm forgetting now.
Arizona State at
20. State. I've got Arizona State at 16. You could probably tell I like the Sun Devils. Right. I have TCU at 24 and Florida at 25. So that catches us up to date with number 21, Washington, another team that barely hit the field last year.
Yeah, barely hit the field. Really kind of unfortunate for them towards the end of the year. They would have, been in the Pac-12 championship game, but I think they had some, COVID protocol issues that really didn't allow them to. Then certainly they didn't play in a bowl game because of the same game. Really unfortunate spring for Washington, specifically on the defensive side of the ball. They had a couple of kids, a couple of the best defensive players. A kid on the defensive line who tore his Achilles, and I'm not even going to try to butcher the name. Then they had a linebacker who had an unfortunate injury that was really a career ender for him. So really a couple of unfortunate blows for Washington on the defensive side of the ball through the spring. From a transfer Patrick O'Brien, who previously at Colorado State, comes in, probably will be the guy, to kind of take over there. The defense, the offense should be a lot better than they were in 2020. Even with that 3-1 record, they have 10 starters back. Certainly, they do have a returning quarterback, but I do think O'Brien will probably get that job as well. Tough early game at Michigan. Will be interesting. That could be a catalyst if they're able to win that game and are could be a catalyst for the season. And the one thing that when you look at their schedule from a conference perspective, Mark, I think the one thing that may give you a little bit of optimism about them is they have UCLA, Oregon, and Arizona State, all three at home. So that will help them out a little bit in terms of from a scheduling perspective.
Washington was supposed to host Michigan in 2020. That game was wiped out. We'll see with a lot of those big-time matchups what becomes of those games that were wiped out. But the Huskies returned the trip to Ann Arbor, pretty much a measuring stick for both programs in certain ways. And for Washington, Jimmy Lake taking over, coach's first season, in quotes, with the 4 games. And as Jason mentioned, they were the best team in the Pac-12 North. With a small sample size, as Oregon kind of faltered, but still got to the Pac-12 championship game. But the Huskies played a really strong 4 games. We'll see what they've got coming up. But the foundation was laid very well by Chris Peterson. They've got a strong roster right there. And Jimmy Lake, we've only seen him for 4 games as a head coach, but the accolades in regards to the talk about his preparation and readiness to be a head coach at this level is without question. So Washington should be in good shape as a contender in the Pac-12. All right, number 20.
Yeah, number 20, I got Coastal Carolina off of the, really the dream season that they had in 2020, going undefeated through the regular season and losing that game in the bowl game to Liberty by field goal, I believe it was, towards the end of the game. So another one of those teams that is a group of 5 team that has tons of stars back, really. I think the group of 5 is really strong this year, Mark. You got, we talked about Louisiana, we got Coastal Carolina, we got, you got Cincinnati up there as well, which we'll get to. But, you could make the argument Grayson Ball could be considered the best dual threat quarterback in the country. All due certainly to Derek K in that fashion, but was phenomenal in his freshman year last year. Schedule's not too tough, especially early on. They should cruise to maybe not cruise. I think they'll probably get to 5-0. They've got it within their first 5 games. They got it to Buffalo. That could be a little bit. And they have towards the end of the season. It is loaded, so they have road games at Appalachian State, State, so that could trip them up. Honestly, Mark, it's hard for teams like that come from relative obscurity to being kind of the media darlings and being an undefeated team last year. It's hard for those types of teams to replicate that in year 2. But I think this team, if any, very much like Louisiana, is positioned to do that with as many starters as they have back and such a good quarterback in Grayson McCall.
Grayson McCall fired 26 touchdowns last year and 3 picks. Certainly had a tremendous season, and Coastal Carolina was fun to track through the season. Had that big matchup with BYU that was exciting on a number of fronts. Of course, it was a game that was not originally scheduled, and just to see the willingness for 2 teams to say, we're going to put our undefeated seasons on the line and out of nowhere schedule each other. It was a fun game. And people should, though, to a certain extent, I'm going to be a killjoy to a certain extent, put the brakes on Coastal Carolina just a bit after they win that game, because to me, BYU was a bit of a paper giant. This is a school that goes 8-5, 7-6 almost every year, and then they basically fell into the worst schedule in the country. It's not their fault, but because of the COVID situation, they fell into the worst schedule in the country, so they were undefeated. And they were still not. They obviously had one of the best quarterbacks in the country, but it was a fun game and a fun outcome. And Coastal playing Liberty at the end of the season in a bowl game, that was a treat too. That was a crazy great game, and Liberty showed that they could play with teams in the ACC and beat them. And so these teams can't be dismissed by any stretch. So Coastal is going to be a whole lot of fun to track again here in 2021. Now we go to the other end of the spectrum in regards to money, facilities, talent, etc. LSU.
Yeah, so LSU, man, LSU, it almost feels like a season mark for LSU where they could be overachievers and maybe finish in the top 10, or they could have another 5-5 or potentially even worse. It almost doesn't seem like there's an in between with them, which obviously means that they'll probably go 8-3 and make a liar out of me here. But order on that, there's a lot of, I would say there's still a little bit of a cloudiness over the program, specifically over the Miles stuff that happened this year in the offseason with Kansas, being released. He's got 5 new assistants in that program, almost like a brand new, kind of coaching change coming into the program. They did not, we mentioned kind of the 5-5 season that they had last year, really kind of a very inauspicious, return from that national championship. I think we all knew that they were going to be down based on the down in terms of not at the same national championship level that they were, in 2019, but I don't know that any of us really expected that much drop off to where they were. Give credit to them. They played a little bit better towards the end of the season, beating Florida in the swamp when that game, really, really mattered a lot to Florida at that point. So quarterback position will be interesting. I think it's probably a two-way battle between Miles Brennan and, the Johnson kid, Brad Johnson's son, Max Johnson, played later in the year, played in that game against Florida. The good thing that you think about from an offensive line perspective, they do return all 5 starters. So that's a good situation, certainly for a team that wasn't anywhere near as explosive on the offensive side of the ball last year. Interesting game to start the season. They traveled to play Tony's boys at UCLA to start the season. So that will be. That'll be an interesting game. Really, we talked about Oklahoma State and Boise State and a couple of others as in Louisiana, Texas as a really an interesting game, kind of off the radar a little bit to start the season. This is another one of those as well. UCLA was much improved last year and only seemed to be getting a little bit better every year from Chip Kelly's perspective. So if LSU goes down there and they lose that game with hosting, they host Auburn, they host Florida, they host A&M, so they have a couple of those games at home, but they have to go to Alabama. So from an SEC perspective, they can't go and lose that game to UCLA. So anyway, in any event, it'll be interesting to see how those new 5 assistants, specifically on the defensive side of the ball, and offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator, are able to to impact. And it's usually a pretty hard transition that very first year, especially early on in the year. So it'll be interesting to see if they can kind of weather the storm and get that win at UCLA to kind of springboard their season, really one way or the other.
Got a crazy stat for you. Miles Brennan, in replacing Joe Burrow, at least for parts of the season until he was injured. So Joe Burrow turns in the most prolific season in the history of college football, throws 60 touchdown passes. And I was on record as saying Miles Brennan could throw 20 less touchdown passes than Joe Burrow, and that's still a great season. If he throws 40 touchdown passes, he was on pace to throw 55 touchdown passes. He threw 11 in 3 games. If he plays out the full season, as Burrow did, 15 games, he throws 55 touchdowns. He was on pace to throw 55 touchdown passes. Yep. And he may not win the job. As you mentioned, TJ Finley transferred because he is out of the competition. Now we got Johnson versus Brennan. I think Brennan's going to win it, but who knows? And LSU, from a talent perspective, top 5 talent in the nation, but do they pull it all together? Are they more of the program that won the national championship 2 years ago, or are they more the program for all that the talk that LSU gets all the time because of these great recruiting classes, because they play in the SEC, because they have a huge fan base? They've not lost less than 3 games in 10 years, except for the national championship season. They go 9-3 or 8-4 every year. They find ways to lose games.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I know there's some conversation about how good of a head coach is Ed Orgeron. He won by and large with Miles players. I mean, you could probably say. So, I know that he wasn't certainly great, at USC when he was there. So I don't know. I mean, the jury's still out on him, from a head coaching perspective. But yeah, I mean, they bring in top 10, if not top 5, top 10 talent every single year. So, I think the one thing that will be, looking at LSU specifically from an offensive perspective is honestly looking at how they'll be from a skill position receiver perspective. They lose Jamar Chase, is one of the top, wide receivers in the country. So, it'll be, and Terrace Marshall also left. He kind of opted out in the middle of the season, which was interesting. So, what does that look like? So, yeah, I mean, it's, they're a, and we'll get to them a little bit, but them in Florida are very interesting, kind of for many of the same reasons.
LSU's talented enough that they had a wide receiver in Racy McMath who was drafted and he caught like 12 passes and nobody heard of him and he didn't see the field and he got drafted fairly high. It wasn't like the end of the draft. It was like the 4th round. Yeah. So, Brittany, we'll get to your question at some point. I don't know if it'll be today, but we're knocking out the top 25, but we appreciate the question on Oklahoma's defense. And if you lock it in on this channel, we'll probably answer most of your questions anyway. But yeah, we will address the Oklahoma defense at some point soon. All right, Oklahoma fans, listen up. You might want to chime in on this one. Number 18.
Yeah, so when I put these rankings together, I don't, the way that I put the rankings together, I don't necessarily, I don't put them in terms of what I think they will be at the end of the year based on their, really kind of based on their.
That's how I do it. I like that. Keep going.
And I also don't, because I know I wouldn't be at all even a little bit shocked if they're AP top 10 to start the year. I mean, that's a little bit egregious, kind of looking at what they have coming back, in just terms of the year and where they're at kind of in the national landscape, but certainly wouldn't be surprised because a lot of that kind of comes back on name. So I've got them at 18. I kind of flirted with anywhere from like 18 to 23 with Texas. So very, very much in the same vein that we talked about LSU. When you have a new head coach, so many different assistants coming in, you're trying to put your culture, embed your culture into the program. So it'll be interesting to see how quickly the players will, kind of will react to that culture, will embrace that culture. Steve Sarkisian, I think he's a good hire for Texas. I mean, I really do. I don't know that they'll necessarily get the same benefits that they're looking for year one out of him, but he's put together a really good staff at Texas. So I think he's a good hire, much to the probably chagrin of Oklahoma fans. But I think it's probably a who knows how good of a hire it is, right? I mean, let's think about the expectations that Texas have, whether it be whether it be fans, whether it be media, whether it be administration. They went, I believe, 7-3 last year. All 3 losses were by 10 points or less. So, and your head coach gets fired because of that. And and I think most people would, at a blue blood school like Texas, would certainly embrace those expectations. So, kind of looking in 2021, certainly they have to replace Sam Ehlinger, one of the better quarterbacks that they've had in the history of the program, specifically in the the last 20, 30 years. Looks like probably Casey Thompson is the guy. I mean, I would really, I think they probably lean his way. I know that he's certainly in a quarterback competition with Hudson Cord there. From a running back perspective, Bijan Robinson looks to be a future star in the making. Hasn't played a lot towards the end part of the year for Texas. Was really good. They've got, on the defensive side of the ball, they've got about 4 or 5 transfers. That's kind of a, when you bank on that many transfers, it's kind of a sink or swim, type of situation. Early on they have they really have a tough schedule. We already talked about the opener against Louisiana. Then they go to Arkansas, and then they play at TCU, and this is all before Red River. So asking them to go in undefeated will probably be tough. I wouldn't be surprised if they're undefeated, Mark, going into Red River, but I mean it'll be interesting if they lose a couple of those games early. Specifically, of the three that I mentioned, Louisiana, Arkansas, and TCU, it could be rough early on for Sarkisian in that role. However, if they're able to win those three, then I think whatever happens in Red River, I don't think the expectations are probably there for Texas to win a conference championship this year. I feel like probably where they're realistically at is maybe 9 or maybe 10-2, maybe 9-3, and maybe just having an opportunity to be in that Big 12 championship game.
To play off of Brittany's point here, and it's a good one, I tell you, every time there's a huge coaching vacancy in the country, it's more about, okay, who's really earned this type of job? What kind of facilities do they have? How much money? What's the recruiting base? All the regular questions get answered and asked. At Texas, it's all of that. Plus, it's the political climate situation. What are the boosters saying? Who do they want? The state legislature, all these factors that don't even get mentioned anywhere else. It's just insane. And I don't know the ins and outs and workings of it, but everybody knows about it. Just the amount of pressure and the amount of power that comes from various factions that put pressure on that football program and the coach and who gets hired is just unlike anywhere else.
It's to tell you exactly how bizarre it is, and I don't know, I can't remember if we talked about this a little bit, Mark, when the time came, but Mike Stoops it was a gentleman's agreement with Sarkisian. He was going to come. I don't know that he was going to be the defensive coordinator, but he was going to be at the very least a positional coach on Sark's staff this year. Had a gentleman's agreement. Mike had really had went through the process of he'd stopped looking for other jobs. He'd stopped interviewing. He was at a point where he was ready to go to Texas, and then some of the boosters and some of the people said, no, you're not. I mean, because he was a previous Oklahoma guy. So I think and luckily for Mike, I know he gets a bad rap from Oklahoma fans, and but he was good for so many years for Oklahoma as a defensive coordinator. Really happy for him. He got I believe the defensive coordinator job at Florida Atlantic this year. So back where he wants to be. But yeah, I mean, that gives you a little bit of an insight on how political and how much bull, as Brittany mentioned, that you have to go through at the University of Texas. It's hard. I mean, it's difficult.
Folks, lock it down in here at our Oklahoma channel, the Voice of College Football Oklahoma, and this is largely due to Jason's efforts here. So check out his work. Jason Ray, Last Word on College Football. Jason Ray, Last Word on College Football. My name's Mark Rogers. If you're not necessarily familiar, because I know I might be talking somewhat to a different audience that sees our videos, but I've got all sorts of stuff going on the main channel in regards to call-in shows and analytics and analysis of college football from a national scale. So if you enjoy that, please check out my work there. But we're focused on Oklahoma here. And of course, we're doing a little bit beyond that with a look at the top 25 in the nation. All right. So let's go to the next one. And for me, Jason, if there is an old reliable in college football, this is the program that regardless of what the recruiting rankings say, regardless of anything, what they're going to do on offense and defense, and they're going to be technically sound. They're going to be fundamentally sound. They're going to hit you in the mouth. They're going to play great football, and they may not be talented enough or fast enough, but they're always going to be good. They're usually 9-3, 10-2 good.
It's kind of funny that you mentioned this, Mark. When I was writing down notes, when I look at Wisconsin, you can count on a few things just in general in life: death, taxes. Wisconsin having a great offensive line and a very, very strong, tough defense. No different in 2021. They're going to have a very strong offensive line. They do have to replace a couple of starters on that line. Very strong defense. No, and I think, to your point, Mark, how it fits with them every single year. Do they have enough talent at the skill positions to win a conference championship? I don't think the answer is yes. I mean, Graham Mertz at quarterback position is a little bit of a wild card. He looked phenomenal in the first game of the year against, I believe it was Illinois when they won. Wasn't that like a 58-0 win early on in the year? It was, something crazy. And then, he was a very inconsistent, even to the point of being bad the rest of the season, and they could not score late in the season. I think they had 2 or 3 games where they were in single digits from a scoring perspective. So I think they're about where they'll probably be almost every year. Can they? They've got the offensive line. They're going to have the running game. They're going to have a good defense. That's probably going to be in the top 30, 40 overall in the country. But can they score enough? I don't think that they're probably. It's kind of interesting that they start with Penn State, because I think Wisconsin and Penn State are pretty much the same kind of team. In terms of they're not gonna wow you with anything on the offensive side of the ball. Interesting schedule for them out of conference. They play Notre Dame at Soldier Field in Chicago early on. They start with Penn State. They host Penn State at the beginning of the year. So, it's the same. Like I said, can they score enough? I don't think that they can score enough to be a top 10 team, but certainly, exactly to your point, they could be a 7-5, 8-4 team this year.
Graham Mertz was a 5-star, and if you understand what Wisconsin typically shows us at quarterback, that's an aberration. Outside of the 1 year that they had Russell Wilson lead them to a Rose Bowl, they march in pedestrian quarterbacks who hand the ball off and run play action, get the job done, and again, lead them to 9 or 10 wins. Well, Graham Mertz steps in as a 5-star, has that phenomenal game week 1 against Illinois where he goes 20 for 21 with 5 touchdowns, and pretty much everybody dismissed it after that it was a blessing that Jack Cohn got hurt. He only led us to a Rose Bowl last year, that he got hurt. We don't need him. We got the 5-star. And right. Actually, Jack Cohn's going to be quarterbacking at Notre Dame this year, and maybe they would want him to have stuck around, because Graham Mertz, not saying that he won't turn out to be a phenomenal player, but he didn't play real good football down the stretch for Wisconsin. The other change in the Wisconsin scheme, or their approach, is there's no just loaded backfield with James White and Melvin Gordon, Monte Ball, and Jonathan Taylor, and they always seem to have at least one guy, if not 2 or 3 NFL running backs. They're pretty thin. They've lost a couple guys, and they're scrambling to put together a running back position, but they'll be there and they'll show up, and again they'll account for themselves. And so I think it's a Wisconsin-Iowa run at the Big Ten championship in the Western side, at least. All right, number 16, according to Jason.
Yeah, so I got the Miami Hurricanes here at number 16. Another interesting team. I've seen them as highly ranked as maybe even the top 10. I've seen them out of the top 25 overall. They have a pretty easy opener to start the season when they face Alabama, and so I think with them, I think it all hinges on Derek King. How healthy will he be to start the season and throughout the season with that ACL injury that he suffered against Oklahoma State? I think from everything that I've kind of read, he's passed all of his checkpoints early on in the spring, some things that I had heard. So that's positive news. I think the one thing that you can count on with Miami, they're going to be a really good offensive team with Rhett Lashley running the show there. Derek King, former Sooner Charleston Rambo there at the wide receiver core position. Much like Wisconsin, but kind of on the opposite side of things, can they stop the opponent enough to win at a high level? They weren't great last year again, specifically I mean, if I was just kind of watching, I remember watching this game very distinctly and just kind of shaking my head at really just how bad they were against North Carolina last year. With a chance to, had an opportunity at that point to possibly, go play Clemson in that ACC title game. But, they were just, insanely bad. I think they gave almost 700 yards of total offense, almost 500 on the ground.
Almost 800.
Yeah, so I mean it was bad, and they weren't very good against Oklahoma State in the bowl game. So I think they're clearly behind Clemson and North Carolina as the two very clear top two teams in the ACC. Then you got Miami. They're kind of in that pecking order with maybe an NC State, with a Pitt, with a maybe Virginia Tech's a little bit down. I think Miami's probably a little bit better than them, but they're kind of in that group, and so the defensive improvement has to be there for them to at least challenge North Carolina.
Miami had a schedule in which they were going to beat the Pitts and Virginias and Virginia Techs of the world, and they played a ton of those kind of games, Louisville, and I knew that they were a cut above those teams, and whether a few of them they blew out, a few of them they let hang around for a one-score game. I wanted to see them play Clemson, knew that they probably weren't up to the challenge, and they clearly weren't, but that North Carolina game, that was the game that I thought, okay, finally get to see Miami play a team on their level. They're roughly top 15 teams. Let's see what happens here. Now, Jason, if somebody would have said after that game, North Carolina scored 62 points and they rang up almost 800 yards of offense, I would have said, first of all, I don't know if I can believe that. Secondly, if you convinced me, I would have said, well, Sam Howell went off. Mm-hmm. He threw 6 touchdowns and threw for 600 yards. No, he threw 19 passes in that game. They handed the ball off to those two monster running backs, Javonte Williams and Michael Carter, and they just ran it down. They just physically beat up Miami, just embarrassed them. So, yeah, Miami's going to have to show that they're capable of taking on those kind of teams.
I mean, and these weren't a lot of tough yards, Mark. I mean, these were like gaping holes.
Yes,
I mean,
the offensive line. Yeah.
The only thing that I can remember, and I don't know that I mean, I'm sure you remember back, but I believe it was 2001. Nebraska's playing Colorado towards the end of the year. Nebraska has a chance. They actually ended up going to the national championship game even after that loss, but it looked very, very similar, just basic runs up the middle with gaping holes. So that's the only game that I can remember, in two, really good teams playing each other where the defense was just astronomically bad. So yeah, no, they've got to get that together because they have the talent on offense. Very much reminds me of, kind of the way Oklahoma looked a few years ago. I don't know that Miami's quite as bad defensively as Oklahoma was a few years ago, but still at that same, that same conversation, that's where they got to improve to get up there a little bit more.
Miami's two defensive ends drafted both, yes, in the first round of the NFL draft. Loaded running back position. Actually, folks, if you don't know, we've got a Miami channel, so lock it in there if you want to trail our Miami coverage. I won't say anything else about the Canes, but De'Ara King is a tremendous quarterback, dual threat quarterback, but the ACL tear, he should be back. That's the projection for Alabama, but man, that's a difficult game to come back to. And yes, Miami and Alabama week 1 in Atlanta. So there we are going to our top 15. Yeah, Jason.
Well, I was just going to say quickly before we go to number 15, and the schedule makers didn't do Miami any favors whatsoever. I mean, when you think of this schedule that they have to start the season, they have Alabama, of course, and then they have, they come back home, but they play Michigan State and Appalachian State. at home. I mean, those aren't gimmies. I know Michigan State's not anywhere near what they have been in the last couple of years, but still, those are tough games. I mean, thankfully, I believe that they don't play Clemson during the regular season, but they do play at North Carolina. So, yeah, I mean, it's going to be tough for them. So, yeah, going to number 15, of course, when you think about the best defense in the Big Ten, obviously Indiana is what comes to mind, right? For everybody, But that's really what they were this past year. They were statistically the best overall defense in the Big Ten in terms of sacks, in terms of interception, turnovers. So another kind of media darling that we saw in 2020. For my money, Mark, one of the best regular season. I don't know how it would rank. I mean, I'm sure we could come up with a top 10 games in 2020. But that Ohio State Indiana game was one of the best games of the year. Especially when you think I think it was, what was it? I mean, 35-14, 42-14 at one point, and then Indiana comes roaring back to make it a one possession game there at the end. So interesting to see what they look like, in this year. They do bring back 10 starters on defense, so they should be solid on the defensive side of the ball. Very similar to the conversation that we had about De'Aaron King. How does Michael Penix Jr. come back from that injury late in the season that he had? I believe he missed the last 2 games of the regular season, then certainly the bowl game. But where does that? He's the catalyst for them. He was really good. I think from one of the statistics that I read, number 1 quarterback in the country in terms of completion percentage when he was under pressure. So really, played really well from a scheduling perspective. They've got some tough games to start the season. They play at Iowa to begin the season. They have Cincinnati at home as well, and then certainly later on in the season they host the Buckeyes for Ohio State. So a little bit of a tougher schedule in 2021 than they had in 2020. But yeah, I mean, a team that could possibly linger in that top 15, potentially get up into the top 10 at some point. Mark, I think you might be on mute. I can't hear you.
There we go. My bad. Okay, I was recapping Jason's last 5 because I failed to chime in with my rankings there. Jason at LSU at 19. I had LSU at 20. He's got Texas at 18. I've got Texas at 15. He's got Wisconsin at 17. I've got the Badgers at 13. He's got Miami at 16. I've got the Canes at 14. He's got Indiana at 15. I've got the Hoosiers at 18. So we're roughly in the same ballpark the last 5. And my thoughts on Indiana was, actually, I thought one of the games of the year last year was Indiana taking on Penn State, and that's what really got them rolling. That was week 1, and they had no business winning that game. They got outgained like 3-1, and they just pulled out a miracle. And Penix made just a tremendous play on a 2-point conversion in overtime to win that game. And then they got rolling, and they hadn't beaten Penn State in forever, and got rolling and only lost to 1 regular season game to Ohio State before Penix, as you mentioned, missed the last couple of regular season games. The bowl game lost to Ole Miss as well. All right, we go back out to the Pac-12, Jason.
Yeah, so I've got Oregon at number 14. Pac-12 champion a year ago, even though they shouldn't even have been in the championship game, but be that as it may, won that Pac-12 championship over USC. And Cristobal has recruited very, very well for Oregon since he's been there. As I was doing a little bit of research, kind of looking at all of the teams, from a recruiting ranking perspective, and I know that you can take that in a lot of different directions, but this will probably be the most talented defensive team Oregon has ever assembled in the program's history. So how does that? You typically don't associate great defensive play with the University of Oregon, but they're going to be solid on the defensive side of the ball as well. And they got a load of talent on offense. I'm not high on Anthony Brown from a quarterback perspective. I think he's probably more of a game manager type of kid as opposed to a guy that can go win you a Pac-12 championship or even kind of contend for a playoff spot if they were to get that high. So it'll be interesting to see. They're going to find out really early. I think it's the second or the third weekend of the year. I think it's the second where they go to Columbus and play Ohio State. They had that game in Autzen canceled this past year, obviously. So they'll find out there. They've got a pretty tough Pac-12 schedule, play at UCLA, at Washington, and at Utah as well. So I think quarterback play is going to be very key for them. I think they have a good enough defense, as we mentioned, to certainly contend for that Pac-12 championship and possibly get in the mix for a playoff spot if things go well. Certainly, if they're able to beat Ohio State early on in the year, they'll be right up there. But I think my biggest concern with them would be the quarterback play for Anthony Brown.
Kayvon Thibodeau's considered arguably the best defensive player in the country and could be the number one selection in the NFL draft in 2022. I thought it was a curious situation with Tyler Shough. He was a big-time recruit, signed at Oregon, gained the starting job as a freshman, threw 13 touchdowns, won a Pac-12 championship, went to the Fiesta Bowl, and didn't play rather well at the Fiesta Bowl, but not a horrible game. And then he transfers to Texas Tech. So, as you mentioned, Anthony Brown, the one-time starter at Boston College, will get his shot. Capable guy that's shown that he can play on the Power 5 level and do a capable job, but not a game changer by any stretch. So, Oregon at 14. I've got the Ducks at 12.
Okay.
All right. Next up, Jason.
So I got Iowa at number 13. They had a couple of close losses early on in the year, won 6 straight to end the year. It's kind of one of those things as I looked at ranking them, where I did, they're not great at the quarterback position. Spencer Petras last year was serviceable, not a world beater, not a game changer. They've got a lot of replacements on the offensive line and defensive line. So as I mentioned to you, those are kind of the 3 components that I look at: quarterback play, and yet I still have them ranked this high. So I really just trust Kirk Ferentz and just his track record at Iowa and how good he's been early on. We'll find out about Iowa early on. They host Indiana. And then they go to Iowa State, within the first 3 games of the year. So it'll be interesting to see, if they win both of those games, they're, I think, in a good position nationally. Agree with you. It'll be between them and Wisconsin, kind of on the other side of that division to battle Ohio State. So I give Iowa a little bit of an edge at this point, but I think that opening game against Indiana is going to be really pivotal for them from a conference standing perspective to get that win and just to see the improvement that they see from the quarterback position. There's a lot of teams that ended well. How are they able to carry that over into 2021 specifically with Iowa with the 6 straight wins?
Had they had capable quarterback play early on, they might have went undefeated. They lost 2 extremely tough, difficult, close games. One of those games they led 17-0, I believe, against Northwestern, and ripped off the 6 consecutive wins. And Spencer Petras, I don't want to just blast him because he did rebound and played okay. Watching the NFL draft, Jason, a couple weeks ago, Amir Smith-Marset was drafted from Iowa as a wide receiver. And the comments made by the NFL analyst was, we wanted to see more out of him, but the quarterback kept throwing the ball in the dirt and over his head and all over the place. So we couldn't see as much out of him as we wanted. So, they need to continue to develop him, because they could have a huge year if he's able to make the throws. This is almost basically Wisconsin South. Offensive line, front 7 on defense. Those guys are going to be a lot of NFL players. Everybody that plays tight end for Iowa goes to the NFL and plays well, but not necessarily a plethora of speed demons at wide receiver or maybe defensive backs. They might be a little slow-footed in areas. But Iowa, I thought I was the one that was getting the jump on Iowa football in regards to my projection that they were going to be better than most people thought. But look at Jason's got them at 13. I got Iowa at 11. So I like the Hawkeyes too.
Very nice. Okay. Yeah. So number 12, this is, to me, out of every team in the top 25 that I have ranked, maybe the biggest unknown. Mullen has, and Oklahoma fans are very well aware of this. I think Mullen caught some flack in the Cotton Bowl by, really just not making the game mean a whole lot from a Florida perspective. Talked about, really kind of talked about having their scout team in there, which really kind of rubbed a lot of Oklahoma people the wrong way. And then coming into the spring this year, he's canceled the spring game. Basically, no media availability for anything going into Florida football in the spring. So it's so much of an unknown. Got a lot of roster turnover, specifically at the skill position perspective for Florida, certainly at quarterback and wide receiver, tight end area. I would look for them to be more of kind of a power running team this year, as they were kind of a spread it out. Certainly, Emory Jones will be the guy. Not quite sure sold on him from a downfield passing perspective, but will be interesting to see what he brings to the team. Certainly, obviously, a better runner. Trask was a bit of a statue back there, but they have a good running back. They have a good stable of running back, so would be interesting to. I think I'll look to see them, kind of move around a little bit in terms of what their offensive identity is. Defensively, really just a bad year, specifically in the secondary. I think they were ranked right around 100 in pass defense. I think 253 yards per game they gave up. Oklahoma pretty much shredded them through the air and on the ground, but particularly through the air as well. So I know they've got a couple of different coaches in that back end of the secondary that they're kind of getting acclimated. They host Alabama week 3. Certainly a good measuring stick for them to see kind of where they're at and the really kind of that transformation. But they've got to get a lot better on the defensive side of the ball, particularly in the secondary, just to be in a position to play into what has become more of a pass happy league in the SEC. Specifically when you kind of talk about Alabama and LSU and Auburn and some of those others. So yeah, I mean, it's like I said, I have them at 12. Just a lot of it based on the talent that they had last year, and but I think it's a bit of an unknown on how good this team actually will be or can be.
I couldn't agree more. I think that this is the most dissimilar team in 2021 from what we saw in 2020. I think we've got a core to work from with all the other teams, but no Trask, no Pitts, no Tony on offense, lost their best cornerback on defense. I just think that I'm going to believe in the talent to a certain extent to say, okay, I know that they've got a talented team, and Emory Jones was highly thought of coming out of high school as a 5th-rated quarterback in the country. But this team, this past season, to your point, if you would have told me at the beginning of the season, okay, on the high note, they beat Georgia for the first time. They got past that hurdle. They won the East. They gave Alabama, a team that clearly showed that they were far and away the best team in the country. They gave them their toughest game on the scoreboard, took them to the wire. I know that Alabama had control of the game, but Florida had a fighting chance at the end, got within a touchdown. If those three things, okay, that they're one of the 5 best teams in the country. They beat Georgia, won the East, gave Alabama their best game of the year, took them to the wire. But then there was Dan Mullen complaining about the crowd noise at Texas A&M is the reason they lost the game, and they had 20,000 people in the stands. Dan Mullen running out onto the field, not helping matters in the middle of a fight against Missouri. Dan Mullen showing up like Darth Vader at news conferences. Dan Mullen giving up at the bowl game, which this is the way you play this situation. These coaches just have to live with what the opt-out circumstances leave them in these bowl games. Mac Brown lost 2 NFL running backs, 2 NFL wide receivers, and his best defensive player going to play a top 5 team in the nation in the Orange Bowl. You know what he did? He kept his mouth shut, played his young players, showed up. They gave Texas A&M a really good game, and people understand, okay, people that know football, okay, that's an understandable loss. You were missing 5 of your best players. You played hard. You played with the players you have. You gave it your best shot. You tried. You really wanted to win. People would have understood, okay, you're showing up against one of the best teams in the country and you don't have your best personnel. And if Oklahoma wins that game by 2 touchdowns, but Florida makes it a game, they play hard, people are going to say that's what a coach should do. Not, we give up, we're not playing, it's not us, it's not our team. No, you're a competitor. You coach a high-profile program. You need to be a man and show up with your team and play. Absolutely. I just thought that was embarrassing and uncalled for. So very uneven season for Florida. All these highs and then all these ridiculous lows. And then it sets us up for, we don't know who they are because the NFL quarterback and the NFL receivers are gone. And wow, it's going to be interesting.
It will. Yeah. A little bit different than LSU, but I think, I don't know. I mean, from a talent perspective, that I think you have to kind of put them somewhere in the top 15, just from a landing perspective. But yeah, no, I don't know. They could, but I mean, I think the good thing about that is you'll find out very early on. I think Alabama's in week 3, so that they host Alabama. So we'll find out early.
On to number 11. Playoff teams, who are the last 3 years?
So, yeah, Notre Dame's really kind of a very similar conversation to what we've had with Oklahoma in terms of, how they are perceived nationally, from a playoff perspective. Notre Dame's lost the 2 playoff games. Certainly, they were fairly competitive against Alabama this past year. We're not competitive against Clemson a couple of years ago. So, I've 2 factors to me that have Notre Dame a little bit outside of the top 10, and at this point, I don't have Notre Dame really legitimately in that playoff conversation in 2021. So 2 reasons: offensive line, 4 out of 5 starters they have to replace, and then we talked a little bit about Jack Cohn. He's not terrible. You alluded to that a little bit ago, Mark. He had a really good 2019 season for Wisconsin. I believe around 2,700 yards, a really good touchdown to interception ratio. I don't know if he's a good enough quarterback to headline a national power, a playoff team. I mean, he might be. I just don't know. So I think for me, the combination of the offensive line and the quarterback is a big enough question mark to have them just outside of the top 10. Obviously, when you're talking about Notre Dame, the schedule's always going to be tough. They start at Florida State, which, again, maybe it's something about the state of Florida. It can't be much worse than what they were last year. So, I mean, you've got to think that they're going to take a little bit of a step forward in Norvell's second year there at Florida State. So that's an interesting, week 1 game. But, we talked about their game against Wisconsin at Soldier Field. They play North Carolina. I think they play Virginia Tech. So, a typical schedule that you would expect, a Notre Dame team to play. So, just outside of the top 10, certainly they're going to be I would expect a worst case scenario, an 8-win team, somewhere between 8 and 10 wins. That where I got them coming in this year.
I've got Notre Dame at number 9. Of course, they lose Ian Book, and just again, my approach to the rankings. And there's a number of ways to do it. There's no right or wrong. There was a caller a couple of weeks ago after I released my top 25, Jason, they called me 3 consecutive nights because he was just so annoyed at the way I approached the top 25 because I do not take the schedule into account. I just rank the teams saying, I believe this is the 25th best team in the country, the 24th best team in the country. I'll get to my predictions later, which will involve, of course, looking at the schedule, but he just couldn't get past that. It drove him crazy. I'm just ranking the top 25 teams in the country. I got Notre Dame at number 9. All right. Number 10 for you, Southern Cal.
Is Southern Cal, and I take a lot of the same approach to you that you do, Mark, in terms of I don't look at where I predict that they'll be ranked towards at the end of the season based on their schedule. Certainly, I talk about it as we talk about some of the great games that are with some of these teams, but have the same approach that you do. So I've at USC at number 10, and it may be a little bit high compared to kind of where they are nationally, but I think USC is a team that has the talent from a roster perspective to not only win the Pac-12 but to be a top 10 team. The question is, can Clay Helton be trusted? Can he be trusted enough at the head coaching position to be to be a top 10 team, to be a top, potentially in that conversation for a playoff if things, if things go the right way. I think one of the best from a pure passing perspective quarterback in the country, in Keaton Slovis. The big question is they were abysmal on the offensive line last year. I think so bad that they hired a new offensive line coach. It didn't look much better in the spring, I believe, from what I went back and read. I think 8 sacks that they gave up in the spring game, so not a whole lot better. That's the clear concern. They've got a lot of talent on the off. They do have that talent returning on the offensive line. Sometimes it's a good thing. Sometimes it's a bad thing when you have starters that maybe just underperformed. To that perspective, they play from a scheduling perspective at Colorado, at Notre Dame, Arizona State. They host UCLA and Utah. So USC. Notre Dame is obviously the big out of conference game for Southern Cal this year. But yeah, I think a lot of this for them will hinge on the offensive line and how well they're able to not only run block but protect Slovis.
Clay Helton has not won to USC standards, but if you look at his record, it's not bad. It's not atrocious. It's been good enough to keep his job. It's decent. I think he's 36-12 in the Pac-12 and won a conference championship. The thing about USC is when they step out of conference, it happened against Ohio State in the Cotton Bowl a couple of years ago. It happens almost annually against Notre Dame. They get shellacked by the best teams in the country, so they're not playing up to what we would expect out of USC. So Keaton Slovis, as I said about Kayvon Thibodeau at Oregon a few minutes ago, being projected as a top 5 NFL draft selection. So he's looking to show out big here in 2021 at USC. On to number 9, and a team that was in oblivion. The program was in oblivion a couple of years ago, and what a job Mack Brown has done.
So what's funny is I kind of chuckled when North Carolina hired Mack Brown. And I don't, did a great job early on at North Carolina, did a great job at Texas, kind of got caught into the kind of the hustle and bustle that is the Texas program. I thought it was a curious hire at best, but he's done great. Kudos to him on how well, number one, he's recruited at a phenomenal level at his age, which is not only a testament to the salesman type mentality that I think he has, but surrounding himself with great coaches on that side. So, and when we look at these top 9 teams, Mark, when I look at 6 through 9, they're very interchangeable to me. I mean, I think you can make a case for Carolina to be at number 6, and then when we go to the top 5, very similar. So Carolina, first and foremost, Sam Howell. At worst, he's probably the 3rd best quarterback in the country. You could make an argument he's the best quarterback in 2011. They returned all 5 offensive linemen, returned 10 starters on defense. The big question is how do they replace those phenomenal players that they had both at the running back and the wide receiver position? Ty Chandler comes over for Tennessee at the running back spot. They have a lot of talent, but it's a little bit unproven. So I think they're solid enough up front on both offense and defensive lines. I think, I know I think as national college football fans in general, I think we're starved for someone to challenge Clemson. We want, and it's not happened. It's not happened year after year. We thought with Notre Dame beating Clemson last year in that game, we thought, maybe Notre Dame is there, and maybe they could be the team for a year, and Clemson won easily in that ACC championship game. So, Notre Dame wasn't the team. Can North Carolina be the team? I think they are. I think they're positioned, maybe better than anybody has been in that current run against Clemson. But we'll see. Scheduling, it's not terrible for North Carolina. They host Miami. They don't play Clemson in the regular season. Opening game of the year, they go to Blacksburg to face Virginia Tech. I believe that's a Friday night game to start the year. So they get past them. They're able to handle Notre Dame at home. Could be undefeated. I mean, I wouldn't surprise me. I think at worst they probably got maybe 2 losses on the schedule. And like I said, at best they go into that ACC championship game 12-0.
Since Florida State handed the baton of the ACC to Clemson, they just completely fell off the map. And yes, we've been waiting for a team to challenge the Tigers. The impressive thing for me about North Carolina, in addition, was, and I knew this before, but it was confirmed watching the spring game, is that they've built a culture. It's very much like Clemson in that they're able to balance this thought of, we're having fun, we're having a good time, we do fun things as a team, and we've got this culture where we're having fun, but we still can all of a sudden go laser focused. It's game week, it's time to get to work. So it's not this old school Nick Saban, Urban Meyer kind of thing where we got to go at it 100 miles an hour all the time, but it's this, like, we're having fun, but we know when to get down to business. And Mac Brown, he's done a phenomenal job, and they are ready to roll. But the running back situation is not anything close from a talent perspective of what they need to replace, but I think that they'll be able to compensate, and the defense should be vastly improved. They returned 10 starters from a defense that wasn't real good, but has the talent to be good.
Right.
All right, I got Carolina at 8. You've got the Bearcats at number 8.
Yeah, so I think one of the conversations, and we had it a little bit this past year, Mark, was Cincinnati, but without a non-conference schedule, they didn't have enough ammunition to bring to the conversation that I feel. This year it's different. This year Cincinnati has Indiana and Notre Dame both away. If they go undefeated, they win those 2 games. Unless you have 4 undefeated Power 5 teams, I don't see how you can leave them out. I think this is the differentiator that we've talked about for years and years with a group of 5 team. We've never had a situation. Boise came close one year, but we've never had a situation where we've had a group of 5 that's both been undefeated and they've had marquee out of conference wins. So they're going, if they beat Indiana, if they beat Notre Dame on the road, they have 2 teams that they will beat that will be top 12, top 15 teams probably when they face them. So certainly it's a big if. Desmond Ridder, a really, really solid quarterback, a little bit inaccurate at times, but he's still a really solid quarterback. They've got some starters on the offensive line to go through from a missing. They lose 3 of those. I neglected to mention this for Notre Dame. Marcus Freeman going from Cincinnati to Notre Dame from a defensive coordinator perspective will be interesting to see how they, looking at some quotes that I've seen. I think Fickell believes this defense can be even a little bit better than what they were in 2020. If they're better at 2020, if they're better in 2021 than they are in 2020, then they certainly have that opportunity to go beat Indiana and Notre Dame. But like I said, I think it all, they play UCF in the conference, which that'll be they actually host UCF in that game, so it'll be interesting to see. But interesting. I'm very, very much excited to kind of hear your comments on Cincinnati, just really just in terms of what you think from a group of five perspective. If they win those games, how do you feel about can they be left out of the playoff even in that situation?
I've got Cincinnati at 17. Again, that is not a prediction on where they land. That's a prediction or a estimation of the talent and them being the 17th best team in the country. But to Jason's point, for anybody who wants to expose the college football playoff, who anyone wants to root for chaos, root for Cincinnati, root for them to go through what is, wow, if you matched up the Pac-12 and the American Conference, if you matched up the American Conference and the ACC minus Clemson, which of course you can't leave teams out, but
right.
The American Conference is a strong conference. Well, Cincinnati, they need, of course, to win those 2 out-of-conference games, which I just think is phenomenal that they scheduled those 2 games. And it looks like they've got Indiana coming through for them as a much better program than what they've been. So, of course, Cincinnati needs to win, and then they need to have Indiana and Notre Dame go on to have, we're not going to go crazy and say, let's go undefeated, but if they did, that'd be funny. Have reasonably strong seasons, top 15 seasons. And then if you're looking at a Clemson season and a Cincinnati season, and you're not going to rate the football teams, just rate the results.
Right.
They've got a stronger resume.
Absolutely. Absolutely. They do.
All right.
I mean, and I'm, I don't want to delve into too much of a playoff talk, but I'm one of those. I mean, I think 16 is way too much, way too many. I'm kind of a proponent of anywhere either 8 or 12. I mean, probably 8 is where I land in terms of really a perfect scenario. But no, I'm in terms of rooting for chaos. Absolutely, you want this to happen. We want Cincinnati to.
And also with Cincinnati, I don't take the results year to year in terms of, I don't think that they should count. We're all 0-0. Forget what happened. Don't downgrade the Pac-12 because you think they're a bad conference because of what's happened in the past, anything like that. It all starts on week 1, and that's how we evaluate the teams in the conferences. But just to show you where this program is, Georgia's arguably the most talented team in the country. Not the best team in the country, but right there as the most talented. Cincinnati, and they were missing some players, but Cincinnati was missing some players in that game too. Cincinnati outplayed them and took them to the wire. And if they didn't mismanage the clock, they would have won the game. They can play.
Absolutely agree with you.
All right, number 7.
Yeah, so I got Texas A&M here. Again, for them, from a quarterback perspective, a little bit of concern. Kellen Mond really was sort of just okay in his career, but had an outstanding year last year. Took care of the ball really well. Was a good reason, why they were so good down the stretch. After that Alabama game, they really, they really played well. So, kind of taking that into consideration this year, got a lot of return. This is when we get into the top 10, top 15 here. There's a lot of offensive line rankings in terms of a lot of teams that have a lot to bring back from a lot to replace, I should say, from a offensive line perspective. Texas A&M is no different. They have 4 or 5 guys to replace. Quarterback battle looks to be kind of a Haynes King, Zach Calzada matchup between those two. They return a lot on defense. They should be strong on the defensive side of the ball. Offensively is where I probably have the most concern. Can they score with Alabama early on in the season? That's that would probably be my concern. Looking at Texas A&M, they do get to host Alabama. They go to Ole Miss, go to LSU late in the year. So I think they're a team that is probably here to stay, just in terms of a top 10 overall. Jimbo Fisher. Think what you will about him personally. A great coach, great recruiter. I mean, I don't know that it's the best idea to go poke the bear, with what he said about Saban, but I mean, it's good to have that confidence going in. So, yeah, just outside of the top five here, they have a chance. If they can beat Alabama, certainly they'll put themselves in position to be back in the playoff, and obviously not back in the playoff, but back in playoff discussion. But I think they're a team that, if they were able to beat Alabama, certainly will win that division. I would assume, but that game's early on. I think it's the first weekend in October is when they host Alabama. I think it's the same weekend as Oklahoma and Texas for Red River. So yeah, it'll be so. Number 7, Texas A&M.
King is the better athlete. Calzada's got the better arm. Based on what I've seen, what I've read, I would expect Haynes King is going to win the job, although it's certainly still a battle and will be through August. Isaiah Spiller, to me, is one of the most fun running backs to watch in the nation. He is a tremendous talent. They lose 2 defensive players to the NFL draft, Buddy Johnson and Bobby Brown, 2 really good players. Buddy Johnson, the heart and soul of that defense, but they return 20 of 22 on the 2 deep on defense. They return all their position players, running backs, wide receivers. It's, yes, quarterback, offensive line, losing 4 starters. The one that stays, Kenyon Green's one of the best guards in the SEC, but they're moving him to tackle because they need help. So that's not necessarily the best formula when you're trying to go up against Alabama and the likes to win the division, but we'll see if they fix the problems. They got a great team. We shall see with A&M at number 7. All right, on to the 6th spot.
So really, Mark, we've talked a lot about in our, previews, we've talked a lot about Iowa State, and honestly, it's weird thinking of Iowa State in a preseason prediction ranking this high. But, I get more and more excited about them as a team. The more I look at them and the more I, think about it. They've got around 21 starters returning. You could make a case, and I don't think anybody would think that you're crazy. And, I would almost, and there might, if you look at some of the top 5 teams, there might be there. But when you look at Brock Purdy from a quarterback perspective, Breece Hall from a running back, Xavier McCutcheon as a wide receiver, Charlie Kolar as a tight end, you're hard-pressed to find another team that has that much talent and production at those 4 positions on the offensive side of the ball. So I think, nitpicking from a offensive perspective, Brock Purdy has a propensity to turn the ball over a little bit. As we saw in the Big 12 championship game against Oklahoma, had a couple of picks, and he turned the ball over against Oklahoma State a little bit as well in the other game that they lost during the regular season. So I think Iowa State has an opportunity to certainly challenge Oklahoma. Very much the same conversation. Obviously, people outside of this channel would want that, but not necessarily people that are watching here. But I think nationally, kind of the same conversation that Oklahoma and Clemson, I think people are starved for, and it's been a little bit closer over the last couple of years, people challenging Oklahoma versus challenging Clemson from an ACC perspective. But I think there's some people that want to see Oklahoma challenged, and I think Iowa State, at least right now, on paper, has the opportunity to do that. They do have a interesting stretch run, in the middle of the season. They go at Kansas State, they host Oklahoma State, they host Texas, and then they go to West Virginia. Those 4 games combined could be a little bit of trouble if they go through. If they beat Iowa early on, they go 3-1, let's say, in that stretch. That sets up probably a top 5 game between Iowa State and Oklahoma here in late in the season.
For people that want to see chaos, we address the Cincinnati situation. For people that want to see the blue bloods knocked out of there and just see somebody else but stay within the conference structure, they're rooting for the teams that we're talking about right now. Texas A&M, can they advance? Iowa State, can they advance? North Carolina, can they get past Clemson, advance, and see some different teams in the college football playoff besides the teams that we see every year? Got Jason Ray on the line from Last Word on College Football. He's running down his way too early top 25. I'm chiming in with my picks as well that were released on my channel a couple weeks ago. I've got Iowa State at 7, A&M at 6. Now we get to our top 5, Jason.
Yeah, so let's set the stage here from a top 5 perspective. You'll be hard pressed to find any 5. These are the 5 teams in whatever order you put them in. These are the 5 teams. I've not seen a single social media post. I've not seen a single media outlet that has any 5 teams that are different than these. So I think pretty confidently, and I say this, and I think you'll probably have somebody else in the top 5 that I'm not thinking about here. But I think, and this is one of the reasons, Mark, where I'm extremely excited about this 2021 season, is because I don't think there's a clear number 1 of these 5. I think you could arguably put Ohio State at number 1 as easily as you could put them at number 5, and really not, and people not think that you're crazy. I think when you look at Ohio State at 7-1 from last year, played extremely well against Clemson in that in the semifinals, specifically Justin Fields. And then, they just ran into a team that was, just on fire, and, a phenomenal offensive team in Alabama last year. So to me, the biggest question mark, and, I know you'll weigh in here a lot. The biggest question mark, it has to be at the quarterback position. You got Jack Miller, you got CJ Stroud, you got McCord, you got those 3 kids that are going to be battling for that spot. And I suspect Ryan Day will not announce a starting quarterback until probably the day of the Minnesota game, Thursday night game, I believe. And so I think the other thing, if you're nitpicking, and I'm going to do a little bit of nitpicking on these top 5 teams, because I think they're clearly ahead of everybody else going into the season. So they do lose 7 of the top 10 tacklers on the defensive side of the ball. So that's maybe a little bit of a concern, specifically kind of in the secondary. But I think they're loaded from an offensive skill position perspective. When you look at running back and when you look at specifically wide receiver, Ohio State, I think hands down, has the best wide receiver core in the country. I don't know that it's even particularly close, just in terms of some of the kids that they have coming back and some of the new talent that they have on the field. At running back, certainly Trey Sermon left, to go to the NFL, but they got talent there. Travion Henderson, I believe that's how you pronounce his name, looked phenomenal in the spring game. I thought he was excellent, ready to play, immediately. So I think it comes down to the quarterback play. Can they get good enough quarterback play at that position? They're not looking for Justin Fields. You can't ask somebody coming in that's never thrown a collegiate pass to be at that level, but can they be good enough? And for me, I don't know how you take away things for the spring from it's really hard for me to take away on how good this guy was, or, I like to see him against live action against another team. So they got an easier path, certainly from a Big Ten perspective, to the playoffs when you think about exactly who they play. Minnesota's, it's an interesting test, right? To begin the season, Minnesota was they struggled a little bit last year, but they were really good the year before. Have a good quarterback, go to Indiana, go to Michigan, and then certainly play Oregon that second week of the year, or second or third week of the year, I believe.
When you've got a team that is not returning a quarterback that has thrown a pass in a collegiate game, and this is the first time in 50 years at Ohio State that they don't return a player on the roster that threw a pass, and you're still the odds-on favorite to win the conference, like no one will pick anybody else to win the Big Ten.
Yeah.
They're just stacked everywhere. Their one glaring issue last year, and they ran into the wrong team in the national championship to have this issue, was that their secondary was deplorable. We had to go back like 30 years to find an Ohio State secondary that was, in talking to my Ohio State analysts and myself, we're like going year by year thinking, when did they have a secondary this bad? And a lot of it had to do with both injuries, but just poor play. didn't have anything to do with recruiting. They all had the stars next to their names, but they just didn't perform, and they were atrocious in pass defense last year. So they got to clean that up.
Right.
And I got to think, Jason, just in terms of probabilities, tell us that they got 3 guys that are high 4 and 5-star quarterbacks that they just need one of them to hit.
Right.
So as long as one of them is the guy that we expect to have at a school like that, then they don't have to be humming along at 100% out of week 1. They can be 70% of what they're going to be and still win the Big Ten. And as long as they don't trip up more than once, they could be one of those teams that's a whole lot better in December than they were in September and be ready to play the Big Ten championship game and in the Final Four of the playoffs. I, like you, have Ohio State right now as the 5th best team in the country.
Okay, so number 4, I have Georgia. I mean, I think the only difference between a Georgia and an Ohio State, specifically on the offensive side of the ball, is a JT Daniels. Played really well towards the end of the year. 10 touchdowns, 2 interceptions over the last 5 or 6 games. I think, as we go back a couple over the last few years, Georgia's prototypically their best. They've been really solid on the defensive side, really, really good. And then they've been decent enough to get, to a playoff game in 2017 and decent enough to where they're at. I think it's flipped a little bit this year, Mark. I think their offense is, you kind of talked about earlier, and I can't doubt you on this comment. Really one of the best, most talented teams in the country is Georgia, specifically on the offensive side of the ball with JT Daniels and James Cook at the running back position. I know George Pickens got hurt early on, so it remains to be seen when he'll be back. But they got a lot of good receivers, a lot of good kids at the skill position perspective. When you look at defense, they've lost a lot in the secondary and the back end. Really kind of the same. When you talk about Ohio State, maybe more of a concern on the secondary side defensively. Very similar for Georgia. And when you look at a schedule, they open with Clemson. So I mean, there's no time to be ready. And I don't love the must-win mentality, especially early on, but I think this is close to a must-win for Georgia for the sheer fact of the schedule. If Clemson happens to lose that game, they don't have a lot of teams that's going to challenge them in the ACC. Georgia, on the other hand, obviously they have Florida, they have Auburn, they have some of these schools, some of these teams that are going to challenge them. So it's a little bit more of a difficult road should they lose to Clemson in that opener, to completely run the table. Not even talking about the SEC championship game against an Alabama or Texas A&M. So have Georgia at number 4 here, just from I think the offensive is going to be much improved. That question mark on the secondary, can they be championship caliber on the back end of that defense?
I ranked Georgia in my way too early top 25, number 1. Now, they lost George Pickens, so they hurt me right out of the gate. They lost their best wide receiver right after I ranked him number 1. And again, this is not a prediction for me. This is I believe that they have the best roster in the country. JT Daniels, yes, stepped in capably and is the guy apparently with that kind of talent around him to deliver the ball. They're stacked at running back. They're stacked everywhere. We can just, but there is a secondary concern. Before I make predictions in August, I will really look at the wide receiver position and the secondary at Georgia. I'm confident elsewhere. And to Jason's point, if you're into the trying to figure out who can do what and who needs what to happen, Clemson, as long as they don't get just terrorized by Georgia in week 1, they can lose that game, go there 13-1 most likely, and they'll be in good shape. But Georgia, that game is more meaningful for Georgia just because of what they have to face in the SEC, and no team has ever lost 2 games and made the playoff. And so if Georgia loses to Clemson, they can run the table, and they're still probably going to be facing Alabama and Atlanta. Right. So it's a difficult run for Georgia. So that game against Clemson is going to be a huge one as we move on through our top 4 here.
All right. So, yeah, I have Oklahoma at number 3. We've talked a lot about, really the improvement over the last half of the year last year for Oklahoma. I think a lot of it hinges on the defensive improvement. Really nothing, they played a lot better, specifically down the stretch against Oklahoma State, against Florida, against some of those teams that they faced in the latter half of the year during that winning streak that they had. When you talk about the 3 things, the quarterback play, the offensive line, and the defensive line, Oklahoma, I mean, I know nationally this is kind of hard to believe, but I think Oklahoma could have you can make a solid argument that Oklahoma has one of, if not the best defensive line in the country. And, there might be some people that are not, just accustomed to typical Oklahoma defense that has your jaw on the floor, but Oklahoma could have, as many as 5 or 6 guys on the defensive side get drafted. So I think that's just a testament to what Grinch has been able to bring in. I think that's a testament to the talent that's been developed when they get there, when they've got there. So Isaiah Thomas, Nick Benito, Perion Winfrey, a lot of good players on the defensive line. So when you talk about that, I think they're finally there to a position where they can make the statement. Yeah, we have a defense that's worthy of winning a national championship this year. So then when you go to the quarterback, Spencer Rattler, again, the same conversation that you have about Sam Howell is pretty much the same as you have with Rattler. I think Sam Howell and Rattler are 1-2. I think I've seen more people kind of have Rattler as the number 1 quarterback and potentially the number 1 pick in the overall 2022 draft. I think there's a couple of things, and really, as I mentioned earlier, nitpicking just a few things for all these top 5 teams. I think Rattler needs to learn to move a little bit better in the pocket from side to side. I think one thing that Lincoln Riley has challenged him with early on, and I saw this a little bit in the spring, and when he was going through, he's making quicker decisions. I think that was one of the things. He held onto the ball a little bit too long. So I think I think you've seen that, but just having that pocket awareness is the next step for him. And I think for the biggest concern for me for Oklahoma is the offensive line, particularly the center position. So I think, and I know there was a comment there about Oklahoma on the offensive line has some concerns, and they certainly do. I think the biggest concern of the team overall is the replacement of Creed Humphrey. We talked about that a lot at the center position. I think they've got a couple of kids that are there. Chris Murray was the guy that that I think we all thought from an Oklahoma perspective that would be the guy that would come back and would be that guy that would take that position. Had some struggles in the spring, really, from kind of the mental aspect of what that looks like. Andrew Rain played a lot. Moved over from his guard position, played a lot at the center in the spring. Looked pretty good. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to shore up that offensive line in the from a championship caliber perspective. If Andrew Rain's ability to put a little bit of weight on his bones, and then also maybe solidify that center position, allows Oklahoma to be better on the offensive line. They desperately need Wanye Morris. He needs to be the guy at the left tackle position. He needs to go, and he needs to really just kind of win that job for Oklahoma. I think in another area, we've talked a little bit about Seth McGowan and Trajan Bridges not being on the team. Really more of a bigger blow for the Trajan Bridges perspective. They've got Mike Woods coming in as a grad transfer from Arkansas, a guy that's proven in the SEC. So I think they're going to be fine. I think they're going to be good enough at the skill positions. I think the schedule's manageable. The non-conference schedule is fairly weak comparatively. Tulane, Nebraska, Western Carolina. Obviously they have the annual game against Texas. Red River is always going to be a battle, no matter, what the records rankings are. I think a couple of other ones at Oklahoma State, Iowa State, at Kansas State could be tough for obvious reasons over the last couple of years. But I truly believe Oklahoma is positioned maybe better than they have been, in a long time to put themselves in that category to compete for not only a playoff win but a national championship this year.
I only had to watch Spencer Rattler play a couple games against quality opponents once they got past the first game of the season to see, okay, he's the real deal. Regardless of he's having maybe a mistake or two in the fourth quarter that cost them of those 2 losses, I thought he's the guy.
Yeah.
And they're just going to have to coach him. And it's understandable. He's a freshman, going to have to coach him out of those mistakes. And they apparently did. And the other thing that they did was, of course, they went from 3.5 yards a rush through that rough stretch to start the season to a dominant running game to protect him and to put him in a position where he didn't have to carry the load like previous Oklahoma quarterbacks have had to do, throwing the ball 45 to 50 times. And I think that's a great place to be. And then when he's ready, they'll unleash him a little bit more. And when they need him, which they will, in a tough Big 12 game or a conference championship or in the playoff to lead a 90-second drive down the field, then he will have a lot of football under his belt at that point to get it done. So I love Oklahoma. I've got the Sooners at 4. All right, Jason. Number 2. Number 2.
Yeah, so for number 2, I have Clemson. A little similar to Ohio State in terms of the quarterback, but just very slightly different. And we've got, and I'm just going to say DJU because I don't want to, from a pronunciation perspective, butcher it. Played in the Notre Dame game, played against, I believe it was Boston College the week before. Played well in those games. I think he played well enough to win against Notre Dame. The defensive play for Clemson in the regular season game, had a couple of players out, which, ultimately we found out in the ACC championship game that was really kind of the difference between the two teams. So I think he's solid. Doesn't have a ton of experience, obviously, but I think those 2 games that he played last year were going to be invaluable for this year. Probably maybe a little bit of concern from a depth. I know their backup quarterback suffered that ACL injury in their spring game, so it will be interesting to see what that depth looks like. If for whatever reason, even if it's for a game or for half a game, if DJU had to go, happen to go down, what does that depth look like? I think they're probably better positioned in the past than maybe they are this year. Travis Etienne finally is gone. I mean, I think he felt like he was there forever. How they replace him, I think is going to be good. I think obviously the leadership of the number 1 overall pick, Trevor Lawrence is will be missed. From more from a leadership perspective. Justin Ross, I'm not sure, and there were some rumors that he might be transferring, and I think more than anything, we've kind of heard about the fact that, I think it's going to be a June-July decision whether or not he gets, kind of back in terms of, where he was at before. I think the defense is going to be solid. Skowski comes back, which kind of solidifies that linebacking core for Clemson. I think they'll be good enough. Secondary got torched a little bit by Ohio State. I think the offensive line was a little bit of a liability, in that game. So that, that showed a little bit of a weakness. So those 2 areas for me. And then, like I said, I think, the reason that I have a Clemson right here is I think they're a little bit more solidified on the defensive side of the ball. And then just the, excuse me, and then just the quarterback, having that little bit of experience, I think helps. And again, we talked about Georgia. I mean, it'll be a big win if they beat Georgia. I mean, you might as well pencil them in for a playoff spot. If they don't beat Georgia, if they happen to get upset at some point in the year, you could see Clemson on the outside looking in. But I mean, I think, Mark, just from a national perspective, I don't know about you. I mean, I'm extremely excited about that game to start the year. I think that might be the best opening weekend game that I can remember that we've seen in really quite some time.
I think that's the game even taking into account conference games where we're going to see the most talent on one field for a regular season game in college football this season. Whether it turns out to be a great game, who knows? But in terms of a matchup, I think it's just about as good as it gets. My differentiation between, let's say, Clemson and an Ohio State is that, Clemson was solid. Well, if you don't take into account Justin Fields' performance, solid defensively in the secondary. And they bring just about everybody back on defense. Their defensive line is going to be something close to what we saw in 2018 when they were historically great along the defensive front. Their offensive line has always been, I don't want to call it a weak link, but just a grade under the rest of the plethora of talent on both sides of the ball. And that remains to be seen. They lose two of the most prolific players in the history of the conference, the history of the college football in some respects, in Travis Etienne and Trevor Lawrence. But the differentiation for me between Ohio State and Clemson is they do have a semblance of experience in big games with DJ Uiagalelei at quarterback versus what Ohio State has. And then again, the defense, I'm more secure in what the defense is. And again, I'm making not a prediction, because I would give Clemson even more strength on the prediction because of the weak ACC versus a capable Big Ten. But I've got Clemson as the second best team in the country, just like you do as well. This number one team that Jason's got is way too early. I think they've been scratching and clawing and trying to get some kind of recognition or respect. And they've come kind of, I don't know, Jason just feels like this program, I guess, is ready to land the number one spot here.
Yeah, they're definitely a program on the rise, Mark. I'm hopeful, for their sake, that they can get up there and they can stay at the top for their sakes. And I think, all kidding aside, you lose a Heisman winning wide receiver, and you lose, one of the best quarterbacks in the country, and you lose a bruising running back, and you still, by many accounts, are number one. And I get it when you look conceptually at that. You could make a case for Alabama to be number 3 or number 4 just on the number of players at the skill position level that they lost. But I trust Nick Saban. I trust the recruiting that they've done over the year. This past year they had the number one recruiting class. Not only the number one recruiting class, but they had the number one recruiting class in the history of rankings. In the 247 era and the Rivals era, in terms of where it's been. I'm also a proponent of unless you lose a ton and where it doesn't make sense, like an LSU a couple of years ago, I tend to really lean a little bit towards the being number one until you get beat situation. So, but I think Alabama is going to be, they're not going to be as good on offense. I don't think, number one, they were historically good last year, maybe even better than that LSU team the year before, which a lot of us said was the best offense maybe ever assembled. You can't lose a kid like Mac Jones. You can't lose a Jalen Waddle. You can't lose Devontae Smith. You can't lose the Najee Harris. You can't lose what they lost on the offensive line and expect to be as good. So I think they'll take a little bit of a step back on offense. Bryce Young was, for me, he wasn't extremely impressive in spot duty last year. Watched him in the spring game. And I have, from an Oklahoma perspective, I have no reason to knock a small quarterback because, conceptually we've got, Baker Mayfield and Kyler Murray as, not your prototypical size, but, I think Bryce Young at a size perspective, I think that's something different than that they've not had to really deal with in the past. Mac Jones was a prototypical guy, Tua Tagovailoa was not probably the typical guy, but he was still fairly tall. So, what does that look like? And I think the skill position, how do they how do they replace those guys? I think majority of Oklahoma fans, they're just going to come unglued if they see Jace McClellan be that number one guy for Alabama this year, which he very, very well could be. He was very impressive in spot duty last year. So I think the offense will take a little bit of a step back, but I think their defense is going to be that much better than they were last year. They return, pretty much everybody, lose a linebacker, I believe, lose Surtain to the draft as well. But I think that they're pretty loaded, not only from a recruiting perspective, but just from a returning starter perspective as well. They got Miami to start the year. I think without getting too much into like a prediction situation, I think you see the typical Alabama opening season game of the year. They look pretty strong against a team that's not quite on their level, but kind of a national name. They do have three. Navigating through that conference season is going to be interesting. They have three relatively tough games away from home. They go to Auburn in the Iron Bowl. They go to Florida, as we already mentioned, and obviously to A&M. So those three games are tough. I think and this is why I'm not projecting, as we talked about, how they will be towards the end of the season. I'm just looking at right now what we see here on May 15th, what Alabama looks like, even with the newness on the offensive side of the ball, even with the new offensive coordinator from the Texans that came over, Bill O'Brien. Then we have that, but I think there's from a talent perspective and coming in, I think they've got too much talent across the board to not be number one, in my opinion.
I believe in the system that Nick Saban has put in place and the talent that he draws to Tuscaloosa. I believe they're the best team in the country when all things are taken into consideration, not just the talent on the roster, but the way it's deployed, there's almost three facets to building the program and getting the result on Saturday. There's the recruitment and the signing of the talent. There's the development of the talent, number two. Then there's the coaching on game day and how you put that talent in motion on game day and strategize and prepare the team for a game and then execute on the field. And they do it better than anyone. There's no question about that. Yeah, they just lost a plethora, that triumvirate on offense, and to expect them to excel to that degree, hey, I wouldn't put it past them if they did, but they don't need to. Right. They were that much far and away better than everybody else this past season. But and also to your point about the Miami game to open the season, that has been in Alabama approach under Nick Saban. They've played Clemson when Clemson wasn't quite Clemson. I'm talking about 10 years ago. Virginia Tech, Wisconsin, Michigan, Florida State, West Virginia. A lot of teams, yes, in that opening weekend that they can certainly handle, that still have a name, but Alabama's going to probably beat them by 20 or 25 points. And I just think that they have few questions to work through. And to lose two first-round wide receivers 2 years ago, then to lose two more this year, and one was the best player in the country, that they continue just to reload. There they are. Jason Ray, last word on college football, very much was interested to see his way too early top 25, and we kind of worked through it together. And that was a whole lot of fun. We appreciate everybody jumping on the line. And again, we expect to be here every Friday at 2:30 Eastern Time, 1:30 Central Time, to talk college football with you, to respond to your comments and your questions, talking Oklahoma football. And this our first edition of Sooners Live. Jason, we appreciate you doing all that work and dropping by, and of course, breaking down the Sooners and the nation.
No problem, Mark. I enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
All right, everyone, lock it in here at our Oklahoma channel and enjoy the content, and we will talk to all of you soon.